Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I never thought I'd lose my home and my dad all at once, but when my stepmom kicked me out and my dad actually took her side, everything in my life spiraled out of control. What happened next was something I never saw coming, and neither did they. Growing up, my dad was my entire world. After my mom passed away when I was 6, it was just the two of us. He used to call me his little champ, and every Friday, we had this tradition of going to the diner down the street for burgers and milkshakes. It was like nothing could ever come between us. Even as I got older, our bond stayed strong. He showed up for every soccer game, helped me with school projects, and always reminded me that we were a team. Then, when I was 16, Lisa entered the picture. My dad met her at some work event, and before I knew it, he was talking about how she was different and how much he liked her. I'll admit, at first, I was happy for him. He deserved to be happy. When Lisa came over for dinner the first time, she brought brownies and acted like she'd known us forever. She laughed at my dad's jokes and asked me all about school. I thought she might actually be cool, but as time went on, little things started to feel off. Lisa's sweetness seemed forced, like she was trying too hard. She would make comments about how my dad and I needed structure or how it must have been hard without a woman's touch in the house. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just adjusting to being part of our lives. By the time I turned 18, the tone had shifted completely. Lisa wasn't sweet anymore. She was critical. She'd make passive-aggressive remarks about how much time I spent at home or how I didn't clean up properly. She'd say things like, "You need to start pulling your weight around here," or "You're an adult now. You can't rely on your dad forever." I knew what she was trying to do. She wanted me out of the house. But I ignored it because, deep down, I believed my dad would never let that happen. Then came the day that changed everything. I had just finished a long shift at work and was looking forward to crashing in my room and maybe playing some video games. But when I pulled up to the house, something felt off. My stomach dropped when I saw garbage bags sitting on the front porch. My garbage bags. Lisa was standing there, arms crossed, with this smug, satisfied look on her face. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't even blink. "You're an adult now," she said, like she was announcing a fact. "It's time to grow up and move out." For a moment, I thought it was some cruel prank. I looked past her into the house, expecting to see my dad stepping in to tell her to knock it off. But when he finally appeared, he wasn't holding a joke in his pocket. He wasn't even looking at me. "Dad," I said, my voice breaking. "What is this?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair like he was stressed. "Lisa's right," he said, avoiding my eyes. "You need to start figuring things out for yourself. You can't stay here forever." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I'm 18, I said, my voice rising. "I'm working part-time and going to college. How am I supposed to live on my own?" Lisa cut in before my dad could answer. "Plenty of kids your age manage just fine. You'll figure it out. It's called independence." I turned to my dad, desperate for him to say something, anything, that showed he didn't agree with her. But he just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "You're really going to let her do this?" I asked, tears stinging my eyes. He finally looked at me, and what he said next felt like a dagger. "I think it's for the best," he muttered. That was it. My heart shattered right there on the porch. My dad, the one person who was always supposed to have my back, had sided with Lisa. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was grab the garbage bags, throw them in my car, and drive away. That night, I crashed on a friend's couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how my life had just fallen apart. It wasn't just losing my home. It was losing my dad, my sense of security, and everything I thought I could count on. But the worst part? I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. After crashing on my friend's couch that night, I woke up to this gnawing pit in my stomach. Everything felt surreal, like it couldn't actually be happening. I replayed the scene over and over in my head. Lisa standing there with her smug grin, my dad's silence, and the way he couldn't even look at me. It felt like a bad dream. But the bags of my stuff in the corner of my friend's living room were proof it was all too real. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I called my dad, half expecting him to apologize and say it had all been a mistake. Maybe Lisa had pressured him, and he just panicked. But when he picked up the phone, his voice was calm, like nothing had happened. "Dad," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "What the hell is going on? Why did you let her do that to me?" He sighed, and I could already tell he wasn't going to give me the answer I wanted. "Lisa's right," he said. as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You need to learn how to be independent. You're not a kid anymore. Independent? I repeated, my voice rising. Dad, I'm working part-time while going to college. I'm barely making enough to cover gas and books. You know that. Everyone has to start somewhere, he said, his tone annoyingly casual, like he was talking about the weather. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So that's it? You're just going to throw me out like I'm some stranger? After everything we've been through? After Mom? My voice cracked, and I stopped myself. He was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd gotten through to him. But then he said, this isn't about the past. It's about what's best for your future. What's best for my future? That line almost made me laugh. You think what's best for me is living out of a garbage bag and dropping out of college because I can't afford rent? Is that what Lisa told you? He hesitated. Lisa wants what's best for all of us. I could feel the rage bubbling up in me. No, Dad. Lisa wants what's best for Lisa. She's been trying to push me out since the day she moved in, and you've just let her. You've let her take over everything. Enough, he snapped, his tone sharp for the first time. This isn't up for debate. You need to take responsibility for your life. Responsibility? The word echoed in my head. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Fine, I said through gritted teeth. If that's how you feel, then I guess I don't have a dad anymore. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking. I'd never spoken to my dad like that before, but I didn't care. He'd chosen Lisa over me, and there was no coming back from that. For the next few days, I stayed at my friend's place, trying to figure out what to do. My friend, Alex, was a lifesaver. He didn't ask too many questions, just handed me a blanket and told me I could stay as long as I needed. But I could tell I was overstaying my welcome. Alex lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, and having me camped out on his couch was starting to take its toll. I spent my days scouring Craigslist for cheap apartments and looking for extra shifts at work. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make the numbers add up. Rent, utilities, food, it was impossible on my part-time income. Dropping out of college seemed inevitable, and the thought of that made my stomach churn. Meanwhile, I kept waiting for my dad to call. I told myself that any day now, he'd realize he'd made a mistake. He'd call and apologize, tell me to come home, and we'd go back to the way things were. But every time my phone buzzed, it was never him. A week later, I decided to swallow my pride and go back to the house to talk to him in person. Maybe if I could just see him face to face, I could make him understand. When I pulled up to the house, it felt strange, like I didn't belong there anymore. The porch light was on, and Lisa's car was in the driveway. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Lisa answered, and the look on her face made it clear she wasn't happy to see me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I need to talk to my dad," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't move. "He's busy," she said flatly. "Lisa," I said, my patience wearing thin, "I'm not leaving until I talk to him." Before she could argue, my dad appeared behind her. He looked tired, older, somehow. But when he saw me, his expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" he asked, echoing Lisa's question. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Alone." Lisa started to protest, but my dad held up a hand. "It's fine. Give us a minute." She glared at me before storming off, and my dad stepped outside, closing the door behind him. I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "How can you do this to me? How can you let her kick me out of my own home?" "It's not your home anymore," he said, and the words hit me like a slap. "You're an adult now. It's time for you to move on." "But I'm not ready," I said, my voice breaking. "You know I'm not ready. How can you just throw me away like this?" "I'm not throwing you away," he said, but his tone was so hollow it felt like a lie. "I'm trying to help you. You'll thank me someday." "Thank you," I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You've abandoned me, Dad. You've let Lisa turn you into someone I don't even recognize." He flinched at that, but he didn't argue. Instead, he just said, "I think you should go." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, hoping he'd change his mind. But he didn't. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting for me to leave. I turned and walked back to my car, my chest tight with anger and heartbreak. As I drove away, I realized something. My dad wasn't the man I thought he was. He'd made his choice, and it wasn't me. That night, for the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. Moving out of my childhood home wasn't just rough, it was brutal. After a week on Alex's couch, I managed to find a studio apartment on the sketchier side of town. It was all I could afford, and even then, it took every penny of my part-time paycheck. The place smelled like mildew. The walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors' late-night arguments, and the only window faced a brick wall. But it was mine. The first night I moved in, I sat on the floor eating instant ramen because I didn't even have a table yet. It hit me all at once. I was really on my own now. There was no backup, no safety net, no home to return to if things fell apart. I had always thought of myself as independent, but this was a whole new level. I tried to juggle work and school, but it didn't take long before the cracks started to show. Between rent, utilities, and food, I was barely scraping by. My college tuition became an impossible burden, and I had to make the hardest decision of my life. I dropped out. The dream of graduating and building a better life felt like it slipped right through my fingers. I told myself it was temporary, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I'd ever go back. For the first few months, I completely distanced myself from my dad. Every time I thought about him, a mix of anger and heartbreak churned in my chest. I couldn't understand how he could stand by while Lisa dismantled my life. The man who used to fight for me, who used to call me his little champ, was gone. Every now and then, I'd hear bits and pieces about what was happening back at the house through family friends or mutual acquaintances. Apparently, Lisa had gone all out redecorating. She painted over my old bedroom walls, replaced the furniture, and even threw away the bookshelf my mom had picked out when I was a kid. It felt like she was erasing me from my own home, and worse, my dad was letting her. I tried to convince myself that I didn't care, but the truth was, it crushed me. That house wasn't just a building. It was where I grew up, where I felt safe, where I thought I'd always have a place. Knowing that Lisa had claimed it as her own made my stomach turn. Then, one day, I got a phone call that changed everything. It was my Aunt Karen, my dad's younger sister. I hadn't talked to her in months, not since before everything went down with Lisa. When I saw her name on my phone, I almost didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could handle explaining everything, but something told me to pick up. "Hey, kiddo," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "How's it going? Haven't seen you at any family gatherings lately." Hearing her say that was like a punch to the gut. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed her. "Yeah, I've been busy," I said, trying to sound casual. She wasn't buying it. "Busy? Huh? Well, I heard through the grapevine that you moved out. What's going on? Is everything okay?" I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to get into it, but another part of me was desperate to tell someone. Anyone. What had happened. So I told her. I told her about Lisa kicking me out, about how my dad had sided with her, about how I'd been struggling ever since. By the time I finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then Karen said, "That doesn't sound like your dad. He would never let something like that happen." "Well, he did," I said bitterly. He stood there and let her throw my stuff out onto the porch. "He told me it was time to learn independence." Karen let out a long sigh. "Something's not right. Your dad has always been stubborn, but he's never been cruel. And Lisa, well, I never liked her. She always seemed a little too controlling for my taste." Hearing Karen say that felt like validation. For months, I'd been questioning if I was the problem, if maybe I was just being selfish or ungrateful. But Karen saw it too. Lisa's control, my dad's uncharacteristic behavior. "Why don't you come over for dinner this weekend?" Karen said. "We can talk more, and maybe we can figure out what's really going on." I hesitated. The idea of reconnecting with my family sounded good, but it also felt risky. I didn't want to be the person who stirred up drama, and part of me was still afraid of hearing more stories about how Lisa had replaced me in my dad's life. But Karen's invitation felt genuine, and I knew I couldn't keep isolating myself forever. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll be there." That weekend, I went to Karen's house, and as soon as I walked through the door, I felt a wave of nostalgia. Her place had always been my second home growing up. The smell of her famous lasagna filled the air, and for the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Over dinner, Karen asked me more questions about what had happened. She listened intently, nodding and shaking her head at all the right moments. When I told her about Lisa redecorating the house and throwing out my mom's things, Karen's jaw clenched. "That woman has some nerve," she said. "Your mom's memory deserves respect, and so do you." After dinner, Karen and I stayed up late talking. She told me stories about my dad from when they were kids, how he used to stick up for her when bullies picked on her at school, how he worked 2 jobs to help their mom pay bills when their dad walked out. Hearing those stories reminded me of the man my dad used to be, and it made me even more confused about how he could have changed so much. "Something's not adding up," Karen said, pouring us each a cup of tea. "I think Lisa's been manipulating him. I've seen it before, People like her know how to get inside someone's head and make them doubt themselves. Your dad's strong, but even strong people have their breaking points. Her words hit me hard. For months, I've been so angry at my dad that I hadn't stopped to think about what Lisa might be doing to him. Was he really this different person now, or was he just caught in her web? Karen squeezed my hand. We're going to figure this out, she said. You're not alone in this, okay? For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I hadn't lost my dad entirely. Maybe there was still a chance to bring him back. After my conversation with Aunt Karen, I started noticing something strange. Every time she talked about my dad and Lisa, her tone would shift. She was usually straightforward, but there was a hesitancy in her voice, like she was holding something back. At first, I chalked it up to the natural tension that happens when someone marries into a family, but as we continued talking, it became clear. Karen didn't trust Lisa. She's different, Karen said one evening over the phone, choosing her words carefully. Your dad used to be so confident, you know? He was always the one who made decisions, who took charge. But ever since Lisa came into the picture, it's like he's, I don't know, smaller, quieter. That struck a nerve. My dad had always been larger than life to me, the kind of man who could fix anything, physically or emotionally. But Karen was right. Even in those final months before I left, he seemed to defer to Lisa for everything. She controlled what we ate, how the house was organized, even what shows they watched on TV. I thought it was just part of the dynamic of being in a relationship, but now I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. My dad wasn't the type to let anyone boss him around. Lisa must have been doing something, pressuring him, manipulating him, or worse. Then, one evening, I got a text from my cousin Emily that changed everything. Emily was Karen's daughter, and we'd been close growing up. After I moved out, she'd been one of the few family members who checked in on me regularly. Hey, her text read, "Can we talk? I found out something about Lisa, and it's weird." I immediately called her. She answered on the first ring. Okay, so I wasn't going to say anything, Emily began, her voice low, but Mom told me what's been going on with you and your dad, and I think you should know this. My heart was already pounding. Know what? She hesitated, then said, Lisa was married before. To this guy named Richard. I remember meeting him once when I was a kid. Mom and I ran into them at the mall. Anyway, he passed away, but the weird thing is, Mom told me he changed his will right before he died. Like, completely cut out his kids and left everything to Lisa. Wait, what? I said, sitting up straighter. Yeah, Emily continued. Apparently, his kids tried to fight it in court, but Lisa had all this documentation showing that he'd chosen to leave everything to her. Mom says she always thought it was fishy, but she didn't know him well enough to get involved. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Do you think she's trying to do the same thing to my dad? Emily was quiet for a moment. I don't know. But if she is, you need to figure it out fast. That conversation haunted me for days. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about Lisa's controlling behavior, my dad's sudden change in demeanor, and the fact that she'd already managed to pull something like this before. I started digging. Late at night, after work, I'd sit in my tiny apartment and search the internet for anything I could find about Lisa's past. At first, I came up with nothing, just basic social media accounts and old photos. But then I stumbled upon an article from a local newspaper in her hometown. Widow wins court battle over husband's will, the headline read. My stomach turned as I scanned the article. It was all there. Her late husband Richard, the contested will, and the accusations from his children that she'd manipulated him into cutting them out. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to convince me that Lisa wasn't just your average stepmom. She was dangerous. The next time I saw Karen, I told her everything I'd found. She listened quietly, her face growing more serious with each passing detail. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. I knew there was something off about her, she said. I just didn't know it was this bad. What do we do? I asked, feeling a surge of desperation. If she's isolating him, and she's already done this to someone else, what's stopping her from doing it again? Karen nodded slowly. We need more proof. Something concrete. If we go to your dad with just this, he might not believe us, especially if she's already gotten into his head. It made sense, but the thought of waiting, of letting Lisa continue to dig her claws deeper into my dad, made me feel sick. Still, I knew Karen was right. If we confronted him too soon, Lisa could twist it around and make us look like the bad guys. The next few weeks were some of the most stressful of my life. Karen and I worked together to gather more information about Lisa's past. while I kept a close eye on my dad from a distance. Every now and then, I'd send him a text or leave a voicemail, trying to sound casual, but his responses were always short and detached. One night, Karen called me with a new lead. "I talked to an old friend of your dad's," she said. "Someone he used to work with before Lisa came into the picture." She told me that Lisa showed up at his office one day, completely unannounced, and basically threw herself at him. She said everyone thought it was odd how quickly they got serious. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Lisa hadn't just stumbled into my dad's life. She targeted him. And now, she was doing everything she could to keep him under her control. But the most damning piece of evidence came a week later, when Karen found a copy of Lisa's old court records. She'd managed to get her hands on them through a friend who worked in law. As we pored over the documents together, it became clear. Lisa wasn't just manipulative, she was calculated. The records showed a pattern of behavior, from her financial disputes with Richard's children to her questionable spending habits during their marriage. "She's a predator," Karen said, her voice trembling with anger. "And your dad is her next target." Hearing those words made my blood run cold. I'd spent so long being angry at my dad, but now I realized he wasn't just complicit, he was a victim. And if we didn't act soon, it might be too late to save him. As Karen and I sat there, staring at the mountain of evidence we'd gathered, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let Lisa destroy my dad the way she destroyed Richard. It was time to fight back. I couldn't sleep the night before I decided to confront Lisa. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smug face, her voice echoing in my head with every cruel word she'd ever said to me. I thought about my dad, pale and distant, like a shadow of the man who had once been my hero. I thought about how Lisa had wormed her way into his life, isolated him, and turned him against me. By morning, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Karen and I had pieced together enough of Lisa's history to see the pattern, and if we were right, she wasn't just after control. She was after my dad's money, his assets, and everything he had worked so hard for. If I didn't act now, there might not be anything left to save. That afternoon, I drove to my dad's house, every nerve in my body on edge. I hadn't been back since the day Lisa kicked me out, and seeing the house again was surreal. The lawn was too perfectly manicured, the flower beds meticulously arranged, like everything was part of a facade. I parked in the driveway and took a deep breath. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to knock on the door. After a few seconds, it opened, and there she was. Lisa. Her face froze when she saw me. It wasn't surprise. It was something closer to fear, like she knew exactly why I was there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp and defensive. "I'm here to talk to my dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You can't just show up unannounced," she hissed, stepping in front of the door like she was trying to block me. "I have every right to be here," I shot back, my voice rising. "This is my dad's house, and you don't get to keep me from him." Before she could stop me, I pushed past her and stepped into the foyer. The house felt different, colder, somehow. The furniture was new, the walls were painted a bland beige, and there wasn't a single trace of anything that felt like home. It was like Lisa had erased everything that made the house ours and replaced it with her own sterile vision. "Dad," I called out, my voice echoing through the house. "Are you here?" Footsteps creaked on the stairs, and then he appeared at the top of the landing. My heart sank when I saw him. He looked tired, exhausted, even. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was pale and drawn. This wasn't the dad I remembered. "Dad," I said again, softer this time. "We need to talk." He hesitated, glancing at Lisa, who had followed me into the hallway. She crossed her arms and glared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You have no right to barge in here," she snapped. "You're not welcome here." I turned to her, my anger boiling over. "No, you've said enough." I looked back at my dad. "This is between me and him. Stay out of it." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but my dad raised a hand, silencing her. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I'll talk to her." For a moment, she just stood there, her jaw tightening. Then she stormed out of the room, muttering something under her breath. When she was gone, I turned to my dad, my heart aching at the sight of him. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice breaking. "You're not the same. You're letting her control everything. Your life, your decisions, even your relationship with me." He sighed and leaned against the banister. "It's not like that," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Yes, it is," I said. "Dad, I've been digging into Lisa's past. Do you even know who she really is?" He frowned, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath and laid it all out for him. I told him about Lisa's first husband, Richard, and how she had manipulated him into changing his will. I told him about the court battles with Richard's kids and the accusations of fraud. I told him about how she had a pattern of isolating her partners and taking over their lives. "She's doing the same thing to you," I said, my voice trembling with anger and desperation. "She's cutting you off from your family, turning you into someone you're not, and you're letting her." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "Then help me understand," I pleaded. "Because right now, it feels like you've chosen her over me, over everything we've ever had." He looked away, his eyes distant. "I don't know if I can do this without her," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice rising. "You're not helpless, Dad. You don't need her. You have me, you have Karen, you have people who love you. But she's isolating you, and you're letting her." "I don't know," he said again, his voice cracking. She's been there for me in ways I can't explain. She makes me feel like I'm not alone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad, the strongest person I knew, was completely under Lisa's spell. And worse, he didn't even realize it. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking, "she doesn't love you. She's using you." He flinched at that, but before he could respond, Lisa reappeared in the doorway, her face twisted with anger. "That's enough," she said, her voice icy. "You've said your piece. Now leave." I looked at my dad, hoping he'd stand up for me, hoping he'd finally see the truth. But he just stood there, silent. My heart shattered all over again. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house, tears streaming down my face. As I got into my car, I realized that saving my dad from Lisa wasn't going to be as simple as telling him the truth. She had him wrapped around her finger, and if I wanted to break her hold on him, I'd have to find another way. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. After the confrontation at my dad's house, I couldn't think about anything else. The image of him standing at the top of the stairs, pale and defeated, was burned into my mind. This wasn't the dad I grew up with, the dad who stood up for me at school when I got into trouble, who stayed strong for both of us after my mom passed. The man I saw that day was a shell of his former self, and I knew exactly who was responsible. Lisa had worn him down. She'd isolated him from his family, taken over his home, and replaced every trace of the life he had before her. It was clear she was manipulating him, but now I realized it went deeper than that. She had trapped him, and if I didn't do something, he might never find his way out. But I couldn't just barge in again, not without something stronger than my word. Lisa had turned him against me, and if I wanted to break through the wall she'd built around him, I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. For the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching Lisa's past. I spent hours scouring public records, social media, and anything else I could get my hands on. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. The court records were the first major breakthrough. I found the details of the legal battle between Lisa and her late husband's kids after his death. They had accused her of manipulating their father into changing his will, leaving them with nothing and giving her everything. The case had been settled out of court, but the accusations were damning. Then I found her financial records. It took some creative digging, but eventually, I uncovered evidence of massive credit card debt, tens of thousands of dollars. And here's the kicker. The debts had been accrued after she married my dad. I couldn't believe it. She was hiding this from him, using his money to fund her lifestyle while cutting him off from his own family. The more I uncovered, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about me or my dad anymore. This was about exposing the truth. I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I called Karen. She'd been my rock throughout this whole ordeal, and if anyone could help me get through to my dad, it was her. When I showed her the evidence, she was as horrified as I was. "This is worse than I thought," she said, shaking her head. "Your dad has no idea what he's gotten himself into." "We have to show him," I said. "He needs to see the truth." Karen nodded, but her expression was hesitant. "You know it's not going to be easy, right? Lisa's going to do everything she can to twist this around. She'll make it seem like you're attacking her out of spite." "I don't care," I said firmly. "If we don't do this, she's going to destroy him. I can't just sit back and let that happen." The next day, Karen and I drove to my dad's house together. I was nervous, terrified, even, but Karen's presence gave me the strength to keep going. When we arrived, Lisa opened the door, and her expression darkened immediately. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. her voice sharp. I'm here to talk to my dad, I said, pushing past her without waiting for an invitation. Karen followed close behind me, her presence adding an unspoken weight to the situation. Lisa tried to block us, but my dad appeared in the hallway, looking confused and wary. What's going on? He asked, his eyes flicking between us and Lisa. We need to talk, I said, holding up the folder of evidence I'd compiled. And I need you to listen. All of it. Lisa started to protest, but Karen cut her off. This isn't about you, Lisa. This is about family. If you have nothing to hide, then you should have no problem with us talking to him. Lisa glared at Karen, but didn't say another word. My dad looked uncertain, but eventually, he nodded and led us into the living room. I started with the court records, laying out the details of Lisa's first marriage and the accusations from her late husband's kids. My dad's face grew more and more troubled as I spoke, but he didn't interrupt. Then I showed him the financial records, the massive credit card debt she'd been hiding from him. This is what she's been doing behind your back, I said, my voice trembling with anger. She's not just manipulating you, Dad. She's using you. For a moment, there was silence. My dad stared at the papers in front of him, his hands trembling slightly. Then he looked up at Lisa, who was sitting across the room with her arms crossed. Is this true? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Lisa's face twisted into an expression of wounded innocence. I can't believe you're even asking me that, she said, her voice dripping with feigned hurt. This is exactly what I warned you about. They're trying to turn you against me. That's not an answer, Karen said sharply, cutting through Lisa's act. Lisa glared at her, then turned back to my dad. They're twisting things, she said. Yes, I had debt, but I've been working to pay it off. And that court case? Those kids were just bitter because their father loved me more than them. I could see my dad wavering, and my heart sank. Lisa was good, too good at spinning the narrative in her favor. But Karen wasn't having it. This isn't about love or bitterness, Karen said, her voice steady and calm. This is about trust. And right now, you need to ask yourself who you really trust, your family or someone who's been hiding the truth from you. My dad looked at me, and for the first time in months, I saw a flicker of the man I used to know. He looked back at the papers, then at Lisa, and finally said, I need time to think. Lisa started to argue, but he held up a hand, silencing her. I said I need time, he repeated, his voice firmer this time. As Karen and I left the house, I felt a mix of relief and dread. We'd planted the seeds of doubt, but I knew Lisa wasn't going to give up without a fight. Still, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd taken a step forward. My dad wasn't free yet, but the walls Lisa had built around him were starting to crack, and I was determined to break through them, no matter what it took. The days following our confrontation with my dad felt like an eternity. I wasn't sure what he was thinking or whether Lisa had managed to claw her way back into his good graces. I wanted to call him, but Karen advised against it. Give him space, she said. He's processing everything. Pushing too hard might drive him straight back to her. So, I waited. And during that time, I couldn't stop imagining all the ways Lisa might be spinning the situation. She was a master manipulator. If anyone could twist the truth and make herself look like the victim, it was her. But then, about a week later, I got the call. Can you meet me for lunch? My dad asked. His voice sounded different, not as tired or distant as before. Of course, I said, my heart pounding. We met at a diner halfway between my apartment and his house. As soon as I walked in and saw him sitting there, I noticed a change. He looked lighter, as though some invisible weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Hey, Dad, I said, sliding into the booth across from him. He smiled, a real smile, not the strained, lifeless expression I'd gotten used to seeing. Thanks for coming, he said. We made small talk for a few minutes, but I could tell he had something big to tell me. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, I asked Lisa to leave. I stared at him, not sure if I'd heard him correctly. Wait, what? She's moving out next week, he said. I've had enough. After everything you and Karen showed me, I started paying attention, really paying attention, and you were right. She was controlling me, manipulating me. I don't even recognize the person I've been these last few years. Hearing those words felt like a victory, but I could also see the pain in his eyes. As much as I despised Lisa, I knew my dad had cared about her, or at least the version of her he thought he knew. Letting her go wasn't easy for him, but it was the right thing to do. I'm proud of you, Dad, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. This is the first step toward getting your life back. But of course, Lisa didn't go quietly. Over the next few days, She launched an all-out campaign to hold on to her place in my dad's life and his finances. She tried everything, from tearful apologies to angry accusations. She even claimed that Karen and I had fabricated the evidence we'd shown him. At one point, she threatened to take him to court, demanding half of everything he owned. "I've sacrificed so much for this relationship," she said, conveniently forgetting the fact that she'd been living off his money while hiding her own debts. But my dad was ready for her this time. He'd already spoken to a lawyer, and with the evidence Karen and I had gathered, they were able to dismantle Lisa's claims one by one. The credit card debt she'd been hiding, proof of financial dishonesty. The court records from her first marriage, a pattern of behavior. Lisa tried to argue that my dad had promised her certain things, but without any legal documentation to back her up, her case fell apart. The final showdown happened at my dad's house, about a week after he'd asked her to leave. Karen and I were there to help him pack up her things, and I'll never forget the way Lisa looked when she walked in and saw us. "This is harassment," she hissed, glaring at me. "You've been trying to get rid of me since the day I moved in." "No," I said calmly. "I've been trying to protect my dad. And now he sees the truth about you." She scoffed and turned to my dad. "You're really going to let them do this to me? After everything I've done for you?" My dad didn't flinch. "You need to leave, Lisa," he said, his voice firm. "It's over." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then she seemed to realize she'd lost. Without another word, she stormed upstairs to grab the last of her belongings. Watching her leave was surreal. This woman who had wreaked so much havoc on my life and my dad's life was finally out of the picture. But even as she walked out the door, I knew it wasn't truly over. Lisa tried one last Hail Mary in court, filing a claim for financial compensation. She argued that she'd contributed to the household and was therefore entitled to a portion of my dad's assets. But thanks to his lawyer and the evidence we'd gathered, her case was thrown out almost immediately. In the end, Lisa walked away with nothing. No money, no house, no power over my dad. It was a satisfying victory, but it also felt bittersweet. The damage she'd done couldn't be undone overnight, and my dad still had a long road ahead of him. After Lisa was gone, my dad and I sat down for a long, honest conversation. He apologized for everything, for letting her come between us, for not seeing the warning signs sooner, and for the pain he'd caused me. "I let myself believe she cared about me," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But all she cared about was what she could take. I was so lonely after your mom died, and Lisa, she made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't realize she was just filling that void with lies." I told him I forgave him, but I also made it clear that things wouldn't go back to normal overnight. Trust takes time to rebuild, and we both had a lot of healing to do. In the weeks that followed, my dad started to find himself again. He reconnected with old friends, got involved in new hobbies, and slowly began rebuilding his life. Karen and I stayed close, making sure he had the support he needed. As for me, I finally felt like I could breathe again. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about Lisa or the grip she had on my dad. She was gone, and we were free. But more than anything, I felt proud. Proud of my dad for standing up to her, proud of myself for fighting for him, and proud of the family that had come together to make it all possible. Lisa's downfall wasn't just about getting rid of her. It was about reclaiming what she had tried to take from us. And in the end, we won. The day Lisa moved out was the beginning of a new chapter, but it wasn't a clean slate. Even with her gone, the damage she'd done to my relationship with my dad lingered like a shadow. I wanted to forgive him, to go back to the way things used to be, but the pain didn't just disappear overnight. In the weeks after her departure, my dad and I kept our interactions polite but distant. He would call to check in, but our conversations were surface level. "How's work? Are you eating well?" Things like that. The weight of everything we hadn't said hung between us like an invisible wall. I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely, and I think he sensed that. But one evening, about a month after Lisa left, my dad invited me over for dinner. "Just you and me," he said. There was something tentative in his voice, almost vulnerable, like he wasn't sure I'd say yes. I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Deep down, I missed him. I missed our Friday diner nights, our easy conversations, the way he used to make me laugh when I was having a bad day. I wanted that back. When I arrived at the house, it felt strange walking through the door without seeing Lisa's ever-present glare. The house itself looked different too, emptier, but in a good way. The gaudy decorations Lisa had insisted on were gone, replaced with the simple, familiar touches my dad and I had chosen years ago. It felt less like a stranger's house and more like home again. My dad greeted me with a warm smile, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't seem forced. "I made your favorite," he said, gesturing to the kitchen table where 2 plates of spaghetti and meatballs were waiting. "Thanks," I said, sitting down. I couldn't help but notice the effort he'd put into everything. The perfectly set table, the candlelight, even the fresh flowers in the center. It was his way of saying he was sorry, even before we'd spoken a word about it. Over dinner, we talked about small things at first: work, family, the weather. It wasn't until we were halfway through the meal that my dad put down his fork and took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I looked at him, my heart pounding. I had waited so long to hear those words, but now that they were here, I wasn't sure what to say. "I should have stood up for you," he continued, his eyes meeting mine. "I let Lisa come between us, and I let her manipulate me. I knew something was wrong, but I ignored it because, I don't know, maybe I didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake with her." Hearing him say that felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For so long, I'd wondered if he even saw what she had done, if he truly understood how much she'd hurt both of us. But now, I could see the regret in his eyes, and I knew he did. "I was just so lonely after your mom," he said quietly. "Lisa made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. But she used that against me, made me feel like I couldn't manage without her. And in the process, I hurt the person who's always been there for me, you." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "You really hurt me, Dad," I said, my voice trembling. "When you sided with her, it felt like you were choosing her over me. Like I didn't matter anymore." "You matter more than anything," he said, his voice breaking. "And I hate that I made you feel otherwise. I'm so sorry, kiddo, for all of it." That conversation was the first of many. Over the next few weeks, my dad and I talked about everything. Lisa, my childhood, even the things we'd avoided discussing since my mom passed away. It wasn't easy. Some nights, the emotions were so raw that I left the house in tears, needing time to process. But every time, my dad would call the next day to check in, to make sure I was okay. One evening, as we sat on the porch drinking coffee, he told me something that stuck with me. "You know, I always thought I was protecting you by staying quiet," he said. "But what I've realized is that silence doesn't protect anyone. It just gives people like Lisa more power." That was the moment I knew he was truly healing. He wasn't just apologizing. He was learning, growing, and trying to make things right. As time went on, we started to rebuild the little traditions that had once been the foundation of our relationship. We brought back Friday night dinners, sometimes at the old diner, sometimes at home. He helped me fix up my car, just like he used to when I was in high school. One weekend, we decided to go through some old family photo albums together. As we flipped through the pages, laughing at the ridiculous hairstyles and outfits, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "This feels good," he said, smiling at me. "It feels like us again." "It does," I agreed, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. The house, too, became a reflection of our renewed bond. Together, we repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and brought back some of the things Lisa had tried to erase, like the bookshelf my mom had picked out and the family photos that once lined the hallway. "It's starting to feel like home again," my dad said one evening as we hung a picture of my mom in the living room. "It is," I said, smiling. "Because it is home." Rebuilding our relationship wasn't easy, and it wasn't instant. There were still moments when I felt the sting of the past, when I wondered if things would ever truly go back to the way they were. But over time, those moments grew fewer and farther between. My dad wasn't perfect, but he was trying, really trying. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had my dad back. It wasn't just about Lisa being gone. It was about us finding each other again, rediscovering the bond that had always been there, even when it felt like it had been buried under layers of hurt and misunderstanding. And in those moments, whether we were laughing over dinner, fixing a leaky faucet, or just sitting together in comfortable silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like I was home. Lisa's absence from our lives wasn't just a physical relief. It was like a heavy, dark cloud had finally lifted. With her gone, my dad and I could focus on rebuilding not just our relationship but our entire lives. We both had a lot of work to do, emotionally, financially, and socially. But for the first time in years, we weren't stuck in survival mode. We could actually think about the future. Not long after our big breakthrough, my dad sat me down in the living room. It was a Saturday morning, and the house felt quiet and peaceful, like it was finally ours again. He had a serious look on his face, the kind he used to wear when he was about to give me one of his dad's speeches. "I've been thinking about something," he started, tapping his fingers against the edge of his coffee mug. You should go back to school. The statement caught me off guard. College felt like a distant dream, something I'd shoved into the maybe someday category. Dropping out had been one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, and it wasn't one I'd ever wanted to make. But between rent, bills, and surviving on my own, it hadn't felt like I had much of a choice. Dad, I can't afford that right now, I said, shaking my head. You won't have to, he replied firmly. I'm going to help you. I stared at him, stunned. Dad, no, you don't have to do that. You've already been through so much. He smiled, a little sadly. I know I don't have to, but I want to. It's the least I can do after everything you've been through because of me. Let me help you get your life back on track. That conversation sparked a series of changes I hadn't dared to imagine. Within a month, I was re-enrolled in college, this time on a better path financially, thanks to my dad's support and a few scholarships I applied for. It felt surreal walking back onto campus, like I was finally picking up where I'd left off. Balancing school and work wasn't easy, but it was different this time. I wasn't doing it all alone anymore. My dad was there every step of the way, whether it was helping me with groceries, cheering me on during finals, or just being a steady presence in my life again. I'm so proud of you, he said one evening after I aced a tough exam. You've been through hell and back, and you're still standing. That takes guts, kiddo. Hearing that from him meant everything. For so long, I'd felt like I was barely keeping my head above water, but now I could finally see a future that wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. As we rebuilt our lives, we also reconnected with the rest of the family. For years, Lisa had kept my dad isolated, cutting him off from the people who cared about him. He admitted that he'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone what was really going on, especially as things with Lisa got worse. I didn't want them to know how much control she had over me, he said one day when we were visiting Aunt Karen. I felt like I'd failed. Karen, as usual, didn't mince words. You didn't fail, Jack. You got caught up with the wrong person, and she manipulated you. That doesn't make you weak. It makes her a predator. My dad nodded, but I could tell it was still a sore spot for him. He was working through it, though, and seeing him reconnect with family was a huge step forward. At one family barbecue, my cousin Emily pulled me aside and said, "It's so good to have you guys back. The way things were with Lisa, it was like you both disappeared for a while." "Yeah," I said, looking across the yard where my dad was laughing with Uncle Mike. "It feels good to be back." But as much as things were improving, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There were moments when I still felt angry at Lisa for everything she'd done, angry at my dad for letting her do it, and angry at myself for not being able to stop it sooner. Sometimes, the bitterness would creep in when I least expected it. I'd be studying late at night or driving home from work, and suddenly, I'd think about all the time we'd lost because of her. All the fights, the pain, the isolation. It was like a scar I couldn't quite get rid of. But every time those feelings threatened to overwhelm me, I reminded myself of one simple fact. Lisa was gone. She couldn't hurt us anymore. My dad and I had made it through the storm, and we were stronger because of it. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, my dad turned to me and said, "You know, I didn't think I'd ever feel normal again after Lisa. But sitting here with you, it feels like home." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. "It does," I said. We sat there in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Lisa had tried to tear us apart, but in the end, she hadn't won. We had. And as I looked at my dad, I realized that this wasn't just a new beginning for him or for me. It was a new beginning for us, together. Looking back on everything that happened, it feels like a lifetime ago. The person I was when Lisa first walked into our lives seems so far removed from who I am now. At 18, I was hopeful but naive, trusting but vulnerable. I didn't know how to recognize manipulation, and I certainly didn't know how to stand up for myself when it mattered most. But Lisa's presence and eventual downfall taught me lessons I'll carry with me forever. One of the biggest lessons I learned was the importance of trusting my gut. Looking back, there were red flags about Lisa from the beginning. She was too sweet, too accommodating, almost like she was auditioning for a role in our lives rather than genuinely connecting with us. I brushed off my initial discomfort as paranoia, but I should have listened to that little voice inside me. That's something I'll never ignore again. If someone seems too good to be true, they probably are. And if their actions don't match their words, that's a warning sign I won't overlook. But the lessons weren't just about recognizing bad people. They were also about recognizing my own strength. When Lisa kicked me out of my home, It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I'd always thought of my dad as my rock, the one person I could always rely on, and suddenly, he wasn't there. For a long time, I let myself believe that I was powerless, that I didn't have what it took to fight back. But I was wrong. Through sheer determination and the support of people who truly cared about me, I managed to pick myself up and fight for what mattered. I gathered evidence, confronted Lisa, and refused to let her win. Even when it felt like the odds were stacked against me, I found a way to keep going. That's a strength I didn't know I had before, and it's something no one will ever be able to take from me again. The most important lesson, though, was about family. For a long time, I was angry at my dad. I blamed him for letting Lisa into our lives, for choosing her over me, for not seeing through her manipulation sooner. And while some of that anger was justified, I've come to realize that my dad was just as much a victim as I was. Lisa targeted him at his most vulnerable, exploiting his grief and loneliness to gain control. She made him feel like he couldn't manage without her, and for a while, he believed it. But in the end, when it really mattered, he made the choice to stand up to her. That's what family is about. Not being perfect, but showing up when it counts. My dad made mistakes, but he also took responsibility for them. He apologized, he made amends, and he worked to rebuild our relationship. And in the end, he chose me. That's what matters. Now, when I drive past my childhood home, I don't feel the sadness or anger I used to. I don't think about the fights, the pain, or the nights I spent wondering if my dad and I would ever find our way back to each other. Instead, I feel pride. Pride because I fought for my family and won. Pride because my dad and I came out stronger on the other side. And pride because I know that no matter what challenges come our way, we'll face them together. Life isn't perfect, it never is, but it's ours. And for that, I'm grateful every single day. When I look at where I am now, back in school, building a future, and reconnecting with my family, I can't help but feel a sense of peace. The scars Lisa left behind are still there, but they're a reminder of how far we've come. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that family isn't just about blood or titles. It's about the people who show up for you, who fight for you, and who help you find your way when you're lost. For a while, it felt like Lisa had taken everything from me. My home, my dad, my sense of security, but in the end, she didn't win. We did.